Thank you for coming to the Concord Bookshop this afternoon. My name is Faye, and we're going to welcome you. And we are overcome by this wonderful turnout. Thank you so much. We were so lucky that Harriet's book came out just at the right time for the Concord Festival. And so here we are. As you all know, you came to see Harriet and to hear more about her wonderful book, the new biography of Louisa May Alcott. It's fitting that the Concord Bookshop is her first bookshop promotion, and we're just so thrilled about that. Thank you. We'll break her in easy. Yeah, we'll break her in easy. Ask her all the hard questions so she'll, know what to expect. Louisa, as I'm sure you know, is one of our favorite local authors, and it's fitting that we have a local author who is her biographer. Harriet is living in Arlington, and she has been a fan of Louisa May Alcott for basically her whole life. She is a writer first. She's a script writer and a journalist and a songwriter even, and has written for documentaries on PBS, WGBH, HBO, and now her first book. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I just want to welcome Harriet Reisen, and we'll hear more about her wonderful book. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you so much. It's so thrilling to be having my first bookshop appearance in Concord, where it all began, and so many senses of that word began. And I must say that when I first came even before I first moved to Boston, I ordered a guidebook that looked really good, and it was kind of offbeat things to do in Boston. And wouldn't you know what the author was? Laurel Thatcher Ulrich,
I'll be darned.
who wrote The Midwife's Tale.
Right.
And she was a graduate student wife, I think, but she had great tips, and one of them was to go see Orchard House. Yeah. And I was, primed from childhood, and even after that. But at that point, Orchard House wasn't even open year-round. And I just kind of got my bags unpacked and managed to get myself there the last day that it was open for the year. It was kind of a raw November day, the kind of raw November day, I think. If I stand here, can I be seen maybe a little better? That both she and her father, Bronson Alcott, were born on November 29th. I don't know if it was exactly that date, but I had no expectation of Orchard House. I had no idea that it would be so rich and that I would feel so sort of possessed. And when I saw her desk, I don't know if you've seen it, but this half circle, tiny little desk, and I thought Little Women was written actually at this desk, and I sort of felt her spirit rising up and possessing me. And ever since, not long after the thrillers began to be published, and not long after that, there was a one-woman show at Orchard House in the Concord School of Philosophy there about the relationship between Bronson Alcott and Louisa Alcott. And that, boy, if Orchard House didn't make you feel the presence of the people, to have Catherine Houghton, who was Katharine Hepburn's daughter, doing this show in the place, I really was excited. And I went to my very dear old friend Nancy Porter here, who by coincidence is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, and told her all about it, and she said, well, let's make a film, kind of a little Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland. And so 20 years later, we did raise the money and make the film, and it'll be on American Masters December 28th at 9 p.m. So it's a whole different take, because it's a film. And I wrote the script for the film using all primary sources. Louisa Alcott, if it speaks only words that she wrote, didn't speak, but were in journals and letters, and the same with Emerson and every other character. So I held myself to that quite strictly. We didn't even have narration. We have some scholars, and we have Geraldine Brooks, who wrote March, commenting, talking heads, if you will, but we really felt that they had a primary connection to the work. They weren't a narrator reading a script. They were speaking out of their own experience and love for Louisa Alcott and the family. So that's how the film reads. Of course, though, that meant I didn't have any words in it at all. And I had a lot more to say. And there were, of course, film being, as Nancy says, 17 haikus. You know, you get a kind of moment and you make an impression, and you hope afterwards that people will then be interested and then go out and want to learn more. So the book came out of that. But also we found out that Louisa's thrillers kept getting discovered. In 1995, I think, The Long Fatal Love Chase was on the New York Times bestseller list for 10 years. I mean, she's one of the rare 19th century authors who is read for pleasure. Just think, what else is read? Maybe Dickens and Twain, Austen, you know, a few of those, but not many people are picked up unless it's a college course. But there was so much more to learn about her, and actually I still want to learn more. There's a number of lost stories, and there's a librarian actually who worked in Concord Library, Dee Clark. I don't know if any of you know her, but she helped us for a while, and she tried to find a lost story for us. We did learn some of the new information in the book was Louisa's actual cause of death, which is not what she thought it was. And you'll have to read about it in the book. Well, it's really not a major thing. It really isn't. She died and she was sick, you know, but this doctor put together all the symptoms. It came up with a more convincing explanation, but what I find intriguing about it was that the clue was in the portrait. The Orchard House portrait, the clue was in the portrait. That just seems so wonderful, straight out of detective fiction. So that's something new in this book. Another new thing came out of quite several years' adventure for me. And began when I read a book called The Alcott's Biography of a Family by a woman named Madeline Bedell. It was written in 1980, and it's a very good book, really a very good book. And in the introduction, she says something about, she describes visiting Lulu Neariker, who was Louisa's niece, who Louisa was raising at the end of her life. And she described this in 1976. This woman was the last person alive who had known Louisa and knew her well for the first 8 years of her life. And she mentioned this in this interview. Well, the Alcott's Biography of a Family was volume 1. And it ends at when Louisa's about 12. And then, unfortunately, Madeline Bedell got cancer and died. And so I knew that interview had never been published. And I wondered where it was. And I asked all the Alcott scholars who we had on tap for the film. I even got some phone books out and called people named Bedell. So somewhere down the line, a few years after I started this search, I picked up a second-hand copy of the Alcott's Biography of a Family, because I would pick up copies because I would have markings in them and they'd fall apart. So, you know, if I saw one, I'd buy it. So I bought this, and I opened it up, and out falls a letter. And it's from Madeline Bedell to the editor, the travel editor of the New York Times at the time, a man named Michael Stern. I think got famous writing about road food. But anyway, it was a carbon copy so this may have been a copy of Bedell's, but on the bottom there was an address in Brooklyn and a phone number. And I called up the phone number, and lo and behold, 20 years later, Bob Bedell lived there. Oh. And so Nancy and I went down to New York to take him to lunch, and we learned that he did not have the papers in his possession. He had given them to a woman who was supposed to be writing a biography of May Alcott, and had not got around to it for years. And she was a very eccentric, Miss Havisham kind of person. But she said we could have the papers because she was about to move, and we saw them, and they were probably took about this much volume of this desk, maybe a bit more. There was a lot. And so we called immediately after we left to say, when can we come down and pick them up? And she stopped answering our phone calls and letters, and we thought she was going to disappear. So after several months, it's a kind of a cute story, and it's in the introduction to the book. But we did get the papers, and so I learned a lot about what happened to Lulu afterwards, and what happened to her, Louisa's fortune, and how the heirs felt about each other. So that's in the epilogue, and that's new. And the papers are still in my study, but they're going to be at Orchard House. We're giving them to Orchard House. Well, so today I thought that I would read parts of the book that have to do with Concord. So I I hope you'll bear with me because I have not done this before. And I have several selections I'd like to read. So I hope I can.
Do you want to sit down again?
You know, you can't see me if I sit down. I think I should stand. I can do that. So I think maybe between, depending on the time, maybe you can kind of keep rough track of the time for me. We might ask a question or two and then go on. So let me get this. I don't think I thanked Faye for the introduction, but now is a good opportunity to thank her for the reading glasses because I forgot mine. Excuse me.
Harriet, I think if you stand right in front of the table, more people back there can see you.
Is that the best? And Nancy's
There's people over there.
ever the producer here. I walk around like in a fog. She keeps me straight. Okay, so this first little bit describes the very first time that Louisa saw Concord, and she was 7 years old. She had turned 7 years old, and they had been living in Pennsylvania and in Boston. The weather on April 1st was frigid and the landscape bare, but an early spring ice storm made for a dazzling introduction to Concord. The girls were in rapture, Abby wrote her father, Abby was her mother, a few days after they arrived. The trees encrusted with ice were a most fantastic and fairy-like appearance. Nothing has escaped their notice and admiration. Dove Cottage, the small and jerry-built brown house on Main Street, was a mansion compared to their cramped rooms in Boston. Anna and Louisa, Anna was Louisa's older sister, corresponds to Meg in Little Women, were soon taking lessons at the Emersons with Mary Russell, wife of the educator William Russell. There they met their fathers and Mr. Emerson's friend, Henry Thoreau, a 23-year-old school teacher who expressed himself in short bursts of conversation, punctuated by long silences. He preferred solitude to most people's company, but children were accepted. Louisa and her sisters trailed after the odd young man as he tramped the Concord woods in his gray pants and straw hat, always with notebook, pencil, and flute. Projecting fanciful personalities and stories onto plants and animals, showing her their ingenious processes, Thoreau taught Louisa to see, read, and appreciate nature. In Little Men, Louisa portrayed Thoreau at this age as Mr. Hyde, who could make birds come to him, and rabbits and squirrels didn't mind him any more than if he was a tree. He'd make snakes listen to him while he whistled, and he knew just when certain flowers would blow, and bees wouldn't sting him, and he'd tell the wonderfulest things about fish and flies, the Indians and the rocks. Free bands of unsupervised children roamed the woods of Concord, their only fears the ones they invented. This domain was an arena for fantasies Louisa made so compelling that other children would play them out no matter how weird or destructive. The naughty kitty mouse was provoked by Louisa's fascination with cats. A malevolent deity who spoke through Louisa, the cat god's high priest was Anna, who found a fearful pleasure in its service, blindly obeying its most absurd demands. In Chapter 8 of Little Men, Pranks and Plays, Louisa describes the sacred rite of the dread naughty kitty mouse, a sacrificial fire inspired by Bronson's stories of the ancient Greeks. The children submit as offerings treasured lead soldiers, paper dolls, a wooden toy village, and a squeaking lamb toy. In anguish, they watch the bonfire swallow their favorite playthings forever, wondering how a storyteller could make them do such a terrible thing. Emerson's long campaign to bring Bronson to Concord, that's her father, I think you all know, was part of a larger effort to persuade his friends to resettle within walking distance of his big white house off the Lexington Road. I think no man on the planet has a circle more noble, Emerson wrote. Will they separate themselves from me again, or some of them? Some would, on and off, usually to avoid not Emerson, but someone else in the circle. Their letters and journals are full of gossip about each other, and their long visits generate more. The brilliant Margaret Fuller, who wore her hair loose and walked with Emerson or was shut up with him in his study at all hours, is given in her letters to hyperbolic enthusiasms and to please to Emerson that he tell her if and how much he loves her. The married Emerson keeps asking her to stop asking and keeps inviting her to visit again. Then there is the case of Henry Thoreau, who lived in Emerson's home for months on end, delighting his son Waldo with stories and music, and staying on in Emerson's absence. Among other guests for weeks at a time were Elizabeth Peabody, the theologian Frederick Hedge, the half-mad poet Jones Very, the second-rate poet, I'm told, William Ellery Channing, the exquisite Anna Barker Ward, her wealthy husband Samuel Ward, and Margaret Fuller's friend, the free-spirited Caroline Sturgis. Subsidizing his friends to keep them nearby made economic sense to Emerson. It bought their intellects for his benefit and afforded them the freedom to develop theirs. He would give the use of his ancestral home, the Old Manse, to Nathaniel Hawthorne and his bride, Sophia Peabody, give Thoreau the use of his land for a cabin at Walden Pond. But of all his friends, he would shore up and subsidize Bronson Alcott the most, opening doors to influential people, giving him work and regular gifts of money, even co-signing loans and volunteering to hold title to property Alcott lived on when his newly acquired socialist principles prohibited it. To get him to come to Concord, he paid Alcott's $52 annual rent for Dove Cottage as part of a plan for him to get his living by the help of God and his own spade as a farmer philosopher, and Orpheus at the plow, as William Ellery Channing put it. Edmund Hosman's children next door were natural playmates for the Alcott girls. 3 of the 5 matched up closely in age with Anna Louisa and Lizzie. Anna developed a crush on 8-year-old Henry. Lizzie found a friend in 6-year-old Lydia, and 7-year-old Louisa adopted Cyrus, Lydia's twin, as her special friend. Cy was a comrade after my own heart, Louisa wrote. We kept the neighborhood in a ferment by our adventures and hair-breadth escapes. Louisa made Cy Hosmer the scapegoat for her misbegotten adventures, which she did very often. You know, she'd say, "Oh, he made me do it." You know, he did not get into scrapes himself, but possessed a splendid talent for deluding others into them. It was he who incited me to jump off of the highest beam in the barn to be borne home on a board with a pair of sprained ankles. It was he who dared me to rub my eyes with red peppers and then sympathizingly led me home blind and roaring with pain. It was he who solemnly assured me that all the little pigs would die in agony if their tails were not cut off, and won me to hold those 13 little squealers while the operation was performed. Those 13 innocent pink tails haunt me yet, and the memory of that deed has given me a truly Jewish aversion to pork. She's so funny. She's so Louisa and Anna conscripted the Hosmers and another neighbor, Priscilla Lane, into their first theatricals, rigging up a stage in the rickety barn behind the house where, in Louisa's account, we dramatized the fairy tales in great style. Our giant came tumbling off a loft when Jack cut down the squash vine, running up a ladder to represent the immortal being. Cinderella rolled away in a vast pumpkin, and a long black pudding was lowered by invisible hands to fasten itself on the nose of the woman who wasted her 3 wishes. As an adult, Cyrus's twin, Lydia, recalled the Alcott children as always very busy about the house, but never too busy to romp and play. Louisa, of course, was always the leader in the fun, racing down the street, usually with a hoop higher than her head. So that was their first period in Concord. It's not the one you hear so much about. And the plays, if you notice, are fairy tales. They're not plays that Louisa wrote. So a question or two? Yes?
After reading Cheney and Stearns' biographies of Louisa May Alcott, I thought she had committed suicide at the end. Did you not come to that conclusion?
I did not come to that conclusion.
Well, morphine, even today, is used to ease out the terminally ill.
Right.
And she had had this tremendous neuralgia from the mercury poisoning for years.
Well, you read about the mercury poisoning, you may be surprised.
I mean, what they say in most of the books. Well, she didn't hold on, and she caught cold. I don't think so.
Okay, well, no, I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
I think she gave herself
one more question, and then I'll go on and read another selection.
So, did you say it was Lydia Hosmer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there are many Hosmers in the Alcott's lives. And even in Lulu's life after Louisa's death. So, and that's a nice little story about Lulu. I'll wait till the next selection, okay? But Colleen,
How
all
did
right.
the writing of the book and the writing of the script intersect?
Well, you know, there are a lot of quotations in this book. I still like the characters to speak for themselves. So I almost had to take some out because there was almost too much. But one reviewer, I was very pleased with this, said, it's as if Louisa is telling her story. And that's, so I'd say that that's the main way. Now the next piece I have is from the time when that she used as the basis of Little Women. You know, the years when she lived at Hillside, now called the Wayside, next door to Orchard House that the Hawthorns wrote.
Speak up.
Okay, all right. Okay. Louisa said her 3 years at Hillside, their new home, were the happiest years of her life, and based most of the incidents of Little Women on them. Is anybody back there? Can you all hear? Raise your hand back there if you can. Okay. A little louder, okay. The house, situated on a crescent of land between the busy road and a sloping ridge, was already old at the time of the Revolution, had been added to haphazardly, and was much in need of repair inside and out. Horatio Cogswell, the most recent owner, had kept pigs in the front yard. Across the road were 8 acres of meadow for an orchard and garden that Bronson, ever the hoper, thought would sustain them for all but a few months a year. Bronson embarked upon renovations enthusiastically. He took pride in his do-it-yourself improvements, curious as some of them were. A cottage on the property he sliced in 2 and placed one half on either side of the main house. He dug a new well and installed a pump so that water was brought through a trapdoor directly into the kitchen, a tremendous and novel convenience. He tore down the rotting fence and made a new one. The garden was impressive, all the more so for being created just as horticulture was beginning to be considered an art. Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of the champions of that idea. Mr. Emerson brings everybody to see it, Abby proudly wrote her brother Sam in early June, adding that Louisa is enjoying the season, weeds with her father like a Trojan. Anna sticks to her books. Elizabeth, Lizzie, is smiling on everything as if love were as cheap as dirt. A steady stream of the curious made their way up the Lexington Road to visit the Bohemian Alcotts. Their antic family life made for entertaining anecdotes. Bronson had been a citizen of the town long enough to acquire a reputation of being a fanatic in belief and habit, recalled Clara Gowing, a contemporary of Louisa. A few Alcott practices were so far ahead of the times they could only be seen as bizarre. On the opposite side of the road, said Gowing, their land extended to a brook where Mr. Alcott built a rustic bathhouse with a thatched roof, which they used daily in warm weather, the girls scampering across the road and field, plunging into the brook and back again. Gowing recalled in 1909, still sounding a little scandalized. Some Concordians, is that right? Concordians? Regarded Bronson Alcott as a mainstay of the Transcendentalist community. Many more thought him pompous and criminally impractical. Thoreau saw his friend as a prophet without honor. Though comparatively disregarded now, Thoreau says, when his day comes, laws unsuspected by most will take effect, and masters of families and rulers will come to him for advice, he wrote. Thoreau came to talk with Alcott nearly every day. He borrowed Bronson's axe to chop timbers for his cabin on Emerson's land at Walden Pond. Bronson helped him frame the structure. Thoreau described his frequent visitor in Walden. He was pledged to no institution. Whichever way we turned, it seemed that the heavens and the earth had met together, since he enhanced the beauty of the landscape. A blue-robed man, whose fittest roof is the overarching sky which reflects his serenity. I do not see how he can ever die. Nature cannot spare him. Louisa was surrounded by the best, the brightest, and the friendliest intellectuals of the day. At 13, she could understand her father's talks with Thoreau now, as she could not 2 years before. When Margaret Fuller came to visit, she could picture herself a grown woman like Fuller, independent, romantic, and literary. Anna and Louisa briefly attended the local school and made friends with other Concord children. Clara Gowing, who was one of them, reported that the sisters were inseparable, that Louisa was a dominant one, and that she often shocked her sensitive sister by some daring speech or deed. Once she took Gowing joyriding in a horse and sleigh hijacked from a neighbor. To keep in touch with their many new friends over the long summer vacation, Louisa made a post office, as Abby had and as Jo March in Little Women would do, using a hollowed-out tree stump on the hill between the Alcott's house and the Gowings. It was visited almost daily or oftener, and cruelly abused, did we feel, if on going there we did not find something for ourselves, Clara Gowing remembered. Louisa's letters especially were refreshing, witty, and warm-hearted and earnest, indignant at wrongs, sympathetic, full of energy and shy daring, much as Louisa was herself. So those are the years that she wrote about in Little Women. Anyway, I can sit. Do you want me to go on? Do you think would you rather have a couple of questions, or do you want to do another little reading? And wait, will you tell me? You know the timing.
Yeah. Why don't we do one more reading?
Okay.
And we'll take questions.
All right. Then I'll do a reading from the period when Louisa became a celebrity, but was living in Concord and taking care of her aged parents, and was admired around town mostly for her devotion to them and her doing their errands and just being one of these women who took care of their families in those days, and of course many still do. But I think it was hard for her to be a spinster, to be a single woman in a place like this. Until recently it was difficult. And so she said some things about Concord, about how dull it was. And you may have heard of all these, but I think it really was because her life was in Boston, where she had writer friends, where she went to the theater.
Oh. What decade?
Pardon?
What decade?
This is, well, you'll hear it, because this is at the time of the centennial celebration in Concord. So this is 1875, a couple of years before her mother's death, and after the publication of Little Women. So she's a famous woman. Excuse me while I drink water. You'll prefer it to the creaking. Okay. Louisa was America's biggest literary celebrity now. Mark Twain was well known, and after the publication of Tom Sawyer in 1875, his renown, carefully cultivated on the model of Dickens, would rival Louisa's. Dickens and Twain enjoyed the spotlight. They appreciated what it could do for sales of books and presented themselves well to audiences. While Louisa loved to act, she hated to enact herself. Besides, how could she possibly succeed in the role of Jo March? Fans who found their way to Orchard House were always disappointed, sometimes to the point of tears, to find an old curmudgeon instead of Spunky Joe. Now you can picture it. But Louisa had no sympathy. It looks like impertinent curiosity to me, but it is called fame and considered a blessing to be grateful for, I find. Let 'em try it. As a last resort, when no one but she and her mother were home and callers persisted in knocking or lurking, she had a ready defense. Costumed in apron and cap and armed with the feather duster prop she had handy by the door, she played her own maid. Opening the door a crack, she would shake the feather duster in the face of the would-be intruder, announce indignantly that Miss Alcott was not at home, and slam the door. And I gather she did this in a very good Irish accent. She really was a professional caliber actress, really. But if she happened to be outside watering plants with the garden hose when strangers advanced, she restrained a powerful impulse to turn it on them, but found that if she simply turned away, they assumed that since the exalted Miss Alcott would never be performing such a menial task, this must be someone else entirely, and walk right past her. Avoiding local friends who showed off by bringing visiting friends and relatives to meet the Alcotts was more difficult. Sometimes she could slip out the back window to hide in the woods behind the house. So I wanted to read that because I thought, I wondered what an impression it might have left when you read about her remarks about Concord. And I guess I didn't get to the centennial celebration, but she complained that there were no seats for women anywhere on the platform, and that the few women who were distinguished Concord women who were seated in the audience were usurped for the wives of politicians, you know, who, the trophy wife, you know. And actually President Grant was there, and women, she and some of her friends were given a place to stand between the platform, like say here, and the audience, like this, you know, wedged between them, and with the boots of the men on the platform kind of making them all dirty, and that's where they got to stand. And President Grant, after he spoke, came down and sat and stood with them. You know, she said she wished she could offer him a cigar. And then the platform, she thought the oratory was so heavy and long in those days. You know, that was expected. The platform started to sink. It started to collapse. Really, I think eventually everyone had to run. But she said it was for want of a suffrage plank. So, I don't know, could I read just one more paragraph? Because there's something she wrote at the age of 13 that I recall at the end of the book when she's very ill and dying, and she writes, "Courage and patience are all I ask." She writes a poem trying to give her courage and patience to endure the suffering that she has had for 10 years with these various ailments. The quiet resignation described by the rich and famous invalid in a Roxbury nursing home was far distant from the boundless hopes and energy recorded by the 12-year-old Concord girl on an autumn morning years before. Driving here, I thought about that autumn morning, much like this one, I suspect. On that long ago day at Hillside, Louisa had awakened before her parents and her 3 sisters and quietly slipped outdoors. She returned ecstatic to write in her journal. "I had an early run in the woods before the dew was off the grass. The moss was like velvet, and as I ran under the arches of yellow and red leaves, I sang for joy. My heart was so bright and the world so beautiful. I stopped at the end of the walk and saw the sunshine out over the wide meadows. It seemed like going through a dark life or grave into heaven beyond. A very strange and solemn feeling came over me as I stood there, with no sound but the rustle of the pines, no one near me, and the sun so glorious as if for me alone. It seemed as if I felt God, and I prayed in my heart that I might keep that happy sense of nearness all my life." So, and she said, actually she wrote in a little note to herself because she went through her journals frequently, and she would write back to herself, you know, at 13 she'd say, "I wish I were more patient, you know, I'm going to try. And then she'd write back, she never did get any patient. But she did write at the end of this that, that she had kept that sense of nearness to God, even though her ideas about religion fluctuated, and so I don't want to leave you with the idea that there's some very interesting stuff about some of her beliefs that I found very surprising, and although they're right out there, I hadn't seen them mentioned. It's very interesting to me, meeting these wonderful advisors we had for the film, what different sorts of things people will take from reading the primary sources. So, questions? Yes, sir?
You mentioned Louisa May's acting abilities.
Yeah.
And I'm on the board of the Concord Players.
Oh, yes.
And we consider her to be the patron saint of the Concord Players.
She was one of the founders.
She was.
Yes.
At the time it was called the Concord Dramatic Club. Do you mention that by name?
I do, and I go into it quite a bit, actually.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, well, she founded it at the time when they returned in 1857 from 10 years' absence from Concord. Really, it's because Elizabeth Alcott, who is Beth in Little Women, hi Jan, was dying, and it was evident that that's what was happening. And Beth, Lizzie, really enjoyed her sister's being on the stage. And they really did it to create this bustle and happiness in the house because their hearts were very heavy. And Louisa played Sarah Gamp, the Dickens character from Martin Chuzzlewit. She would, this Cockney nurse, this very disreputable, kind of a funny character, at Lizzie's sickbed. And it was very difficult for her to do. And there's wonderful, very sad story about one of the friends from the Dramatic Society visiting. And he recollected that on a Sunday after church, he came into the house, not knocking as friends used to do. And when he opened the door to the study, she suddenly, turned away and threw some white material she'd been sewing on the sofa, and then ran out of the room saying, "It is Lizzie's shroud." So it was her sister's shroud that she was sewing. And of course, she was letting her feelings out, but when she would be he described her as going up and down to her sister's room, acting, blithely as this character, and then going downstairs for this vigil until her sister needed her again, because her sister, I think, preferred her as the nurse, and she liked doing that. No other questions? Yes, did I see one over here? No. Okay, well, thank you for coming, and please watch the film if you can on December 28th at 9.
I just had one question,
Sure.
Harriet, if
Sure.
I may, and that is that, of course, I know that you've read her other books too, and I used to enjoy her other books, although Little Women is by far my favorite. But I do believe she was quite ahead of her time as far as being quite a feminist and going out for women's suffrage, because in one of her books she says, "I predict the woman of the future will have a ballot box."
Well, not more than that. She voted in Concord. She was the first woman.
Yeah, and
to
I
vote.
think that, and I just...
And led a registration drive. It's in the book. There was a fight for her mother said, I mean to go to the polls and vote if my daughters have to carry me. And but she didn't. She was a founder of the women's suffrage Massachusetts Association in, I think, 1832.
Really?
Yes, so Louisa came from a tradition of anti-slavery and abolition, and really there were a lot of women writers among the transcendentalists, and it was a very interesting movement in that way. It's very romantic. It really was a romantic movement. One more question, or I'll do two. You two, okay.
Yes, could you comment on the evolution of both the documentary and the biography, and how is the research related, and which came first?
Well, Nancy and I tried, this is Nancy over here, we tried off and on for 20 years. At one point, I wrote a treatment for a feature film, about the experience at Fruitlands, for example, and I wrote an article about what happened at Fruitlands. So I was always reading every book about or by Louisa that I could get. It was almost a hobby. And periodically we would see these opportunities, and then about, was it 2002, 2003, we decided we would go for it, even though we'd had no encouragement up to that point. So we've got some grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then a number of other foundations. And so we started developing the film, and I was just reading everything, and my thoughts were going around and around, and I don't know if I hadn't finished the script by the time we went for the book, I don't think, Nancy. Anyway, the script evolved.
Right.
And the book began around 2005. The film was shot 2007. It was filmed in 2007. And they're both coming out in 2009, just barely under the wire. So I don't know if that answers your question. But the incidents in the film are in the book, and it's my interpretation of Louisa. And the film is Nancy's directorial take on it, and from my script, which was also a shaping of the materials, very actively so. So I joke and say, well, not a word of mine is in it, but pretend. You decide which words are going to be and which aren't. Anyway, there was one more lady in the green sweater.
Do you feel that Louisa really did want to get married, but felt that she couldn't because she was needed to support the family? Do you have any feelings?
Well, you
on
know,
that?
there's no proof, but there is a poem called, is it called Love? Love. It's called Love. It was found in her papers, and of all the poems that I've seen, it has no date. Appears to be late. And she writes about a little maiden who was told that a prince would come and find her, and she writes about how he never came, and that he had suitors, and that, but she was going to hope because she would find, she was old and sick, and she said, and there will be a prince that'll be the eternal friend. So I think she might have wanted to, but marriage itself was not the egalitarian institution it is now, and she also she felt that motherhood was pretty incompatible with a career, because I think she felt so much for children that for her it might have been. And then she was the sister who was left to keep house and support the family. Lizzie would have been the sister who kept house if she had lived. Anyway, there's some funny stuff. There's a suitor. There's the shortest, punchiest Dear John letter you've ever read in your life. To a man who proposed.
That's hilarious.
So, did you think you say it?
Yeah, thank you, Harriet, and I can't wait to read the Dear John letter.
It won't take you long.